Welcome back to the Mixed Media Podcast. This is the second section of the day. We'll be talking about video games and how to get good at game development. We just finished listening to Ben's segment on the Astroworld tragedy. Let's get into it. So I'm specifically going to be talking about getting good at game development from the standpoint of someone who's either a solo dev, or a small team. Someone who's also looking to do it commercially and not just as a hobby, because there's certain to get good at doing things commercially is going to require a certain I can't speak English today. A certain subset of skills that are not necessarily required if you're doing it as just a hobby. Game development is very strange in terms of getting good at any form of art because, well, for one, it's a mixed media, meaning that it has multiple forms of art within it, right? So maybe it has 3D modeling, it's a story, so you need to be good at writing. There's game design, stuff like that. So it's like, how do you get good at the whole thing? Do you do it all at once? Do you do it in parts? Stuff like that. I'll get into that. And also, it's not as easy just to do rapid iteration where you make a game and then you're like, okay, here's what I thought was good or bad about it. This one you need to improve on. Let's make another one. Games take a decent amount of time to make, even small ones. So that's not necessarily as viable as an option. Whereas someone like a musician or a drawer might be more inclined to do something like that. So you really have to be careful about every game you make. It's like, you have to be careful with how you choose what you're going to make, because it's not like something you can just keep doing like every other day or whatever. So for this reason, a lot of game developers feel like they only have a few tries at making games before they reach their commercial success. Few being relative, of course, to, as I said before, like drawers and stuff like that. You don't necessarily have time to make a few dozen games. That'd be kind of insane. Within any reasonable amount of time, unless they were super, super small. And if you want to be commercially successful, you may not want to make something that's super, super small. And you would like to be able to practice the entire pipeline of game of decent size from beginning to end, right? So, I think there are 3 steps to becoming better at game development that you sort of just do it, and then you just go back to the start and you do it over and over and over again. So first, I'll just go do an overview. All three steps are observation, practice, and reflection. These seem pretty generic, as in this probably applies to most arts, but I'll get into them very specifically and how it's different from game development versus other forms of art. And you can sort of think of these as sort of before, during, and after phases of game development. Unless, I guess you could consider the observation and reflection also part of game development in a way. So for observation, one of the safest things you can do is to cut down on how long you actually observe things for, right? So what I'm trying to say is observe things that are actually important. Try not to observe things that are superfluous, things that won't help you in the long run. I mean, you can observe things just for the sake of interest and just, being like, oh, maybe this won't be something I will ever use, but I'm at least interested in it, right? But don't go into learning something that you think that you're like, oh, I should do my game development studies today. Let me go learn something. And then you learn something that's not even relevant to anything you will ever be doing ever. It's very easy to fall into that trap. So, in most forms of art, you observe by, watching a tutorial or reading something. For example, in 3D modeling, you might learn how to make the famous Blender donut or the famous Blender chair. I guess it's not specific to Blender, but whatever. If you're drawing, you might start out by drawing like a box or something like that, and learning perspective and things like perspective, stuff like that. So what do we do in game development? Well, game development needs a lot of things. There are a lot of things within game development, so this doesn't really translate as well. I think you need to focus on very sort of broad things. Yeah, so sort of broad things, like, for example, things like procedural terrain generation, right? That is something that is both specific and sort of broad, right? The specific part is that, well, it only works in games where you have procedural terrain generation. Not many. But the broad part is that to do that, you need to learn how to do procedural mesh generation, and that has a lot bigger of a use. Or I guess it depends how you do it. You could perhaps do it the height map way, in which case you learn how to use height maps. and that is also pretty widely used. It's not uncommon for people to procedurally generate meshes, not uncommon for people to generate height maps. And so you want to, try to keep a focus when you're practicing things or when you're observing things, so that you can practice them later. So maybe you're focusing on level design this week or whatever. Maybe you're focusing on game feel. These things often tend to be more theoretical. As I said before, certain things that wouldn't be useful tend to be things that are more specific, very practical things, like learning how to code X thing or code Y thing, because certain features are not going to be used in most games, right? Like, I don't know, say learning how to make a wall running mechanic. How many games actually have wall running in them? Not many in the grand scheme of things. Enough of the tutorials about them, but not enough where you would expect that you are going to make a game with wall running in it. So that's why you need to focus on general things like level design and game feel. It doesn't have to all be theoretical. For example, player movements, say specifically top-down character movement, is a pretty simple thing to learn, but still something you need to learn nonetheless, and something that you can be reasonably sure you are probably going to use top-down character movement sometime in your game development career, and that also will translate to other like top-down. It doesn't have to be two-dimensional. It could be a three-dimensional game too. Translate to movement there as well. As well as part of your observation, you should probably also be observing trends, right? So because you're doing this commercially, not as a hobby, you need to know what kind of game will sell. And so while you're learning all the other stuff, it's a good idea to look at what's going on currently with games that are currently out and sort of figure out where are they going. I can't remember who said this. It's a nice quote, but it's like, I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like, as a business, you need to figure out what the customer wants before they know they want it, essentially. So, for example, 100%. Like a good example is like battle royales.
Oh, I was just saying I agree entirely. Yeah, people go on both sides of that equation where they go, you should take your business in a direction where you're just responding to demand, which can get you a business, but it's not. That's a different kind of route than what some people mean, where they're like, I want to make a big business. Well, that's not gonna quite get you there. And then on the other side, people will say, well, I just need to make something, right? And neither are correct. You need to make what people need or want before they know they want it, basically.
Yeah, sort of the annoying part about game dev is that you move so slowly because everything takes so long. So that's why I say aim for the future and don't aim for the present, because when you finish your game, that the trend might be gone already. This is not necessarily as applicable for big companies who are able to move a lot faster than you. But if you're like a small team or a solo dev, I mean, it's going to be a bit tough to try to keep up with other companies as well. Like other companies, a loss for them is not as big as a loss for you. A loss for them might be like, they're still afloat. They still have a company that exists. Well, your company still does not exist, if your first thing is a failure. At least they have something to stand. Observe trends, try to figure out where things are going. What tech do you think will be prevalent in the future? Perhaps currently we're talking about like things like VR, right? VR is very undervalued currently, I think. Like the VR explosion has yet to happen. We saw the initial thing like, Beat Saber, for example. It's like that was popular, but people still haven't bought the VR headsets to play the game. It's like that's a popular thing to watch, not a popular thing to play necessarily. So we still haven't seen the big VR explosion that I am expecting, and I think it's not a uncommon prediction if you just look around the game community. It's like for people who are more knowledgeable, VR has those signs of being about to explode. Maybe not now, but maybe not like tomorrow, but sometime essentially within my lifetime, probably. Actually, surely definitely within my lifetime.
Within 10 years, VR is going to be exploded, is my prediction.
Yeah, sort of like it's like the consumer and the company is just playing with each other. It's like who's gonna make the first move, and once the ball starts rolling, it's not gonna stop. Other predictions like what genre will be the next battle royale. As I said before, who would have known that like battle royale would be the popular genre of the times, except those who started with it, right? People potentially saw the signs that potentially this would be a good way to go, and they hopped on it thinking that it'd be a good investment for the future, and they did it. And as you can see, like certain companies like Epic Games made Fortnite, which was during I believe they started development, during the explosion of Battle Royale. Well, as I said before, they're a big company. They can move fast, a lot faster than you can. So they don't have to worry as much about that kind of stuff. So yeah, what I'm saying is I would not suggest that you make a Battle Royale currently unless your idea is pretty good. Because by the time you finish, Battle Royales are probably here to stay for a good amount of time. But you're not going to make any sort of like breakthrough game likely. You're never like Fortnite and PUBG already exist. You're never going to be able to become the top dog there. You're forced to be below them essentially. So yeah, and Apex Legends too. So yeah. But yeah, after you observe, I think the second step is to practice. So observing by itself will only get you so far. I think one problem I see with a lot of developers is that they just observe. They just like look at things and they're like, oh yeah, I'm learning, I'm writing down notes and stuff like that. And eventually, one day I'll make my game, and it's like, okay, but have you tried like any parts of that first? That's definitely it's like you wouldn't expect someone to, I don't know, go to art school for painting, for example, and they just watch, they attend lectures. They never do any sort of like painting themselves. I'm assuming the school wouldn't force you to paint, which they would, but just ignoring that. They never do any painting, leave college, and they're like, all right, I'm gonna paint something. It's like, it's not gonna be good. You need to actually do some painting while you're observing, or after you observe, I guess. So yeah, so experience is required. I'm not gonna explain why you need experience to do this sort of stuff. It's sort of outside the scope of this topic for now, but I guess I can make another episode about experience and the balance between experience and observation, stuff like that. But as I said before, making a whole game by itself takes a long time, so you want to avoid doing that when possible when you're practicing. So that'd be sort of like, I don't know, you're learning to cook and you make like a whole four-course meal like every single day. It's like, that's gonna be draining very fast. And even as a cook, I'm sure you can pump out food a lot faster than you can a game as a game developer, even with a team. So yeah. At the same time, you also want to experience the whole game development pipeline, because you don't want it so that when you're trying to make your first commercial success, you don't want it to be your first time, because there's going to be a lot that you don't expect that happens probably because you don't have experience there. So I think if you want to do the whole process, come up with a small idea, and then like reduce it to like 25% of whatever you thought of, essentially, because whatever you're going to do, you might think it's going to take a week. It'll probably take like a month. So reduce your scope infinitely. I know it's like pretty generic advice. It's like, if you ever heard anybody ever in the indie sphere talk about anything, they have said, hey, your scope, remove it, reduce it to something less. But it really is just that important. And because I'm talking about practicing, I think it's important to state that you don't want to be practicing these small ideas. You want to be practicing these miniature ideas that will actually be small ideas because you overscoped originally. As well, you should probably start forming your skills in game development away from game development, because say, for example, making 3D models or sprites, you don't need to do that within the context of a game. You can make 3D models outside of a game, and then the skill will transfer to when you're doing it for a game. There are, of course, some things that are very game specific, like you don't want to make a 3D model with like a trillion triangles in it and have your GPU try to render that. You want to try to simplify things a bit, but at the basic part of it, you need to like learning the basics. You have to learn the basics anyways, right? There's no reason to learn the basics while you're also doing it in the context of game development. That's just going to confuse the whole situation, right? So even if you're like not at the basic level, even if you're pretty good at it, right? If you just know what you need to do for when you put it in the game, right? So optimizing the number of triangles and stuff like that, then when you put it in the game, it won't be as bad, right? So at the start, you can just work on doing it outside of the game development sphere. Then you learn, what do you need to do to make it viable within game development? There aren't really that many modifications for like 3D modeling, but stuff like optimization, sure. And then you try to put it into a little sort of test playground game thing. That's not even a full game. It doesn't need to have like an end objective. It doesn't have to have even any sort of interesting mechanics. If it's something as simple as testing 3D model, you just put the 3D model in a game engine, see if it works, right? It would work, obviously. Assuming, I guess all you're doing at that point is making sure you understand the export, which is disturbingly hard on certain engines to export a 3D model into it. But stuff like, applies to not just 3D modeling, but as I said before, sprites, things like music, crafting stories, stuff like that. You don't want to start doing that all within the context of game design. Unless you just focus on, well, I guess this is my next step. Yeah, my next step is reflecting. If you are able to just do these small things, right? Just do music or just do like writing and stuff like that. What that lets you do is also just focus on that one thing. So when you go back to reflect, you don't have to you're not bombarded with like a whole game where you're like, okay, but what, like maybe you play and you're like, this is not so good. You're thinking, what part of it is bad? Is it the art? Is it the music? Is it the storytelling? Is it the game mechanics? Like so many variables that it could be. If you just pull it apart and you have these small sections, then you're gonna have an easier time identifying what went wrong. Because it's definitely sometimes can be hard. It's strange. Obviously, I just said like stuff like it could be the music or writing. Those are two very different things, but sometimes it's still hard to tell like what's off. When you reflect, though, don't just reflect yourself, because you yourself are going to be blind to the mistakes you made because you just made those mistakes. So in theory, you did not know that those were mistakes. It's going to be a very, very long road for you if you only ever just internalize your own stuff and try to figure it out based on that. It is possible. It's going to take you a longer time, though, than it would otherwise if you just ask for help from outside sources. Well, not help, just help with understanding where your game did well and where your game did bad. And, well, I should say you shouldn't just be asking them to review a game. You should be asking them to review those smaller chunks I was talking about before, like a 3D model or something like that. So, maybe you can ask a friend. I think the easiest option is just to ask on social media. It's pretty simple. Something like Reddit, where if you have something like an Instagram, it's very hard if you don't have a following to ask for feedback, because not many people are going to receive your posts if you had no following. But on Reddit, it's very easy to get your stuff circulating to random people. So asking on Reddit, or maybe like a Discord community you're in, something like that, that's a good idea. So yeah, don't if you're on Reddit, probably should not send the whole game unless it's like a commercial product or something like that. You can send clips of your game, perhaps. Yeah, send chunks of a game potentially to be like, hey, how does the movement feel? If you're making like a platformer, you want the game feel to be perfect. How does the movement feel? Stuff like that. Send a 3D model, send a song, send a sprite, stuff like that. And don't rely on feedback from the masters. And what I mean by that is, don't go, oh, I have this game. I wish Hideo Kojima would review it for me. He's not reviewing your game. He has better things to worry about. I'm afraid. Whatever. Whoever you find inspiring within your field, they're probably not going to care to review your game, because they probably get 1,000 requests to do that every day, and if they did that, they would have no time to do anything else. So, especially when you're a beginner. If you're a beginner, if I'm a beginner 3D modeler, and I ask, I don't know, that was a bad example. I actually, here. If I ask, what's his name? Ian Hubert, hey, what's wrong with this, I don't know, this texturing on my 3D model, right? He might know what's wrong with it, but it's likely something so simple. I'm talking about if I were a beginner, by the way. If you're a beginner, this applies to you. It's probably something so simple that anybody who is just an intermediate 3D modeler could have told me anyways. And when you become advanced, that's when you might actually need advice from the masters. It's not gonna be as you're not gonna Ian Hubert might even tell me something advanced, and I probably won't be able to implement it because imagining I were a beginner, haven't gotten there yet, right? It's like he's telling me how to run before I learned how to walk, essentially. And so I think joining a game feedback community is probably useful for this kind of stuff. You get to it makes things feel a lot less lonesome. You're all in this together kind of thing. It's like a mutual thing, where it's like symbiotic, where you're helping each other out, and I guess that feels sort of nice, right? As well, it's also good for observing, because if you're in a feedback community, not only are you the one who is receiving feedback, but in theory, you're also doing your part in giving feedback. And when you give feedback, it's also a part of observation, because you're looking at what someone else has done, and you're analyzing what's good about it and what's bad about it. And you might learn something from that yourself. And even if you don't know what's good about it or bad about it, somebody else might say what it is, and then you can look at it and be like, oh, well, assuming he's right, then I can apply this to my own stuff, stuff like that. From this, you learn, where you need to get better. So, once again, in the context of 3D modeling, maybe my texturing isn't good, and I know I have to work on that specifically. And that sort of loops back into the observation practice thing, right? Where it's like, now I've learned this, I'm going to observe more things about this, and I'm going to practice this specifically. And that's pretty much all I have to say for my topic.
Cool. I had a lot of practicable advice in there, like, very clear, like, here's what you need to do. So I quite like that. Yeah,
also, a lot of this comes from personal experience. A lot of this comes from various sources and stuff like that. One of the good sources I found recently is this channel. If you ever used Blender before, you 100% know him, the Blender Guru. He has a podcast called the Andrew Price Podcast. That's his name. I think it's just called the Andrew Price Podcast. And he talks about this kind of stuff, or actually, not even just on this podcast. He has videos about it too. But this podcast, he does talk about it a lot because he accepts questions from viewers, and a lot of them are stuff like, how do I practice effectively and stuff like that. So